Hi, this is Mohammed Khan, and you're watching the Unemployed GM podcast, which is still not a podcast, and I'm coming back after a little while. I think it's been a little bit more than 3 weeks. I've been very busy with like a lot of people with Ramadan and also with work. But I wanted to come back and kind of um, get back on the channel and start talking about sports. There's so much that's going on. We're in the heat of a title race in England. Interesting developments out of Syria. A lot of interesting fun things happening in cricket right now with the IPL and the NBA playoffs as well. So a lot of really fun things. If you're interested in sports. Um, the purpose of this vlog, if you will, is to deconstruct an article and really make a comment about Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. I was recently reading an article in the Guardian by Ben McAteer, titled "Spurs are staring at years of failure unless they rebuild properly." And one of the things that I like to do, and in many ways, you can say that I'm self-taught, is I like to use these articles, articles that I read, whether they're related to sports or whether they're unrelated to sports, and use them to, fortify some of the beliefs that I already have, or alternatively, to dispel some of those beliefs, right? Because you learn something new. And so deconstructing an article is a learning tool, in my opinion, where you read an article, you analyze it, and you make a comment on it. And once you comment on it, you can then embed that into your team building process. One of my fundamental beliefs is, you know, the team building process is a competitive advantage in executive management, right? It's not data, it's not recruitment, it's not scouting, it's none of these things, right? These are all things that are valuable. Obviously, if you're not able to evaluate talent, you're not going to be good at this job. But ultimately, I think what separates teams, what separates organizations is, having a team building process. And so, I read this article, and there's nothing in this article that I would say that is, truly unique, that is different from, other things that you might have read or about Tottenham, or seen other blogs, or something, things that you haven't observed yourself. But I think he makes a lot of points that I want to piggyback off of, to make my comments, and that's going to be the purpose of kind of this type of vlog. And so the backdrop to this is, Tottenham goes away to Newcastle United. It's a pivotal game. It's going to decide who's going to be in the top four, or most likely decide who's going to be in the top four. And Tottenham gets pretty much slammed, right? They get dominated by Newcastle United. Newcastle scores five goals in the first 20 minutes. Um, Tottenham continues to lose the ball over and over and over again in their own half. Newcastle get on the counter, and they're phenomenal, right? Newcastle was phenomenal. They're flying, and Tottenham was all over the place. And eventually, Spurs lose 6-1. The loss cost Christian Stellini his job, and Stellini is subsequently replaced by Ryan Mason. Uh, and I think in this backdrop, I wanted to make two comments. Number one was, and I'm going to start this comment with a question: why wasn't Ryan Mason appointed when Antonio Conte was fired, right? Mason in many ways is kind of a natural replacement in these cases, and he would have done. He did a reasonable job replacing Jose Mourinho at the end of the season a couple years ago, and he fits the profile of this kind of reliable caretaker manager, who understands Tottenham, who's kind of been through this already, who's an aspiring coach. He's been in the backroom staff with Mourinho. He's been on the backroom staff team with Conte, and he's been part of kind of Tottenham's coaching ecosystem. He knows the players really well. And so, whatever you may think about, Ryan, as a coach, as a potential coach in the future, for these types of situations, it didn't make a lot of sense to me that Stellini would be the one that got the job, although I thought it was interesting. And the reason that I thought it was interesting is that assistants like Stellini, who've been longtime assistants with Conte or others, are kind of viewed as kind of these loyalists. They're kind of, support staff for the coach rather than support staff for the club. And I think it was actually interesting that Tottenham did hire or did replace Conte with Stellini. Usually, what happens is Conte or guys like him are fired, they're let go, but they're not let go alone. Their entire staff is let go, and there's a complete reset at the football club because there's kind of no succession planning or none of those ideas really exist. And so I think it was interesting, but I didn't think it made sense, right? Because I think Ryan Mason was kind of like this natural kind of firefighting type of person to come in and replace Conte and kind of get Tottenham to the end of the season, where by then they can kind of reset and restart going into the next season. Um, and I think I think the real topic of conversation here with respect to Stellini is not necessarily what Stellini did. Obviously he changed the formation. Goes into a back four when Spurs are really kind of built on playing a back three with two wing backs. If you look at their squad, they have Pedro Porro, they have Perisic. These guys are wing backs, right? They have a certain instinct. They want to go forward. While they obviously are defenders, they can come back and do that job. That's not something that they necessarily want to do, right? They want to be, trying to build the attack, in a way, right? So, there's a great conversation if you want to listen to a conversation about the tactical part of this or the kind of line of construction part of this. The BBC Football Daily on Monday did a really good breakdown of this, and there's a really good conversation between, Chris Sutton and Micah Richards, excuse me, on this. And I think Micah is 100% correct, right? I don't know what Chris Sutton's talking about, but Micah is 100% correct in evaluating what what Perisic is good at, what Porro is good at, and that he's not saying that those guys can't defend. What he is saying that is that you're putting them in a position that they're not necessarily good at, right? And you're asking them in the middle of the season to do things that they haven't done in a while and haven't done in a long time. So, nevertheless, my second comment is succession planning, right? I think succession planning is a huge part of running any business, any organization. Obviously, that's not just me. That just has to be a part of how you run an organization. But I think by replacing Conte with Stellini, Spurs, like Chelsea before them, have demonstrated that they don't necessarily have, succession planning codified within their kind of organization building framework, their team building framework, right? Keeping in mind kind of the amount of churn that you have in professional sports today, specifically amongst elite coaches like Conte. It's surprising that that a club the size of Spurs or Chelsea or other clubs don't have a succession plan in place for these kind of special situations, right? Like the one with Mourinho, like Conte, like Nuno. Spurs have hired and fired a bunch of managers for the last couple of years, and they're not alone, right? This is a football problem. You see this in cricket, you see this in basketball, you see this in other sports, in American football, you see a lot of it. And the fact that there's no kind of codified succession plan is interesting to me, right? And what does that look like? Well, I think that looks like, hey, if something like this happens, Ryan is the guy who's going to come in, so long he's with Tottenham or he's available, that he's the guy who can come in and he can do this job. And hey, even before that, this is what that job looks like, right? This is what that firefighting job looks like. Um, that kind of caretaker manager, right? These are the attributes of a caretaker manager. Um, the next thing is Ben, he talks about, actually, another backdrop to this is yesterday, because I'm coming a little bit late, and talking about this is, Spurs are coming off of a real fighting draw against United when they went down 2-0 and they came back and away from home. And they were excellent yesterday. I think in the second half they were really good. Not perfect, obviously, but the goal by Porro and then Son, they were a real threat on the attack. And obviously with Charleston finally playing alongside Son and Kane, Kane, you saw him drop a little deeper. Excuse me, drop a little deeper and really be a threat on the counter, right? And make some really great crosses and really great passes to specifically to Son. And obviously that's what helped get the goal. And so they're brilliant. But in the article, uh, they're brilliant to draw the game, but obviously they still seem to be on the outside looking in terms of the top four. They really don't seem to be playing like a top four team. You look at Newcastle, or look at even Villa. The momentum they have. Spurs don't have that right now, and certainly they don't have that stability. But in the article, and I'm gonna read this word for word, and then I'm gonna respond to it. It was Pochettino, and the Pochettino book by Guillaume Balaguer is one of the great books. Everybody should read it, and it really dives into the success of Tottenham in that period with Pochettino and Daniel Levy. But let me just read this again. It was Pochettino who first called out the need for greater investment. As the club focused on building a new stadium to rival the best in the world, Pochettino was overachieving with the tools at his disposal. When you talk about Tottenham, everyone says you have an amazing house, but you need to put it in the furniture. That's a quote from You need to put in the furniture. That's a quote from Pochettino in 2019. He was right, and that's Ben McAteer saying that he was right. And so while I understand what Pochettino was saying, and I certainly sympathize with some of that, um, I'm someone who generally believes that you have to work within the framework that you've been given. I think Pochettino generally did that, and I think that's been generally his mentality. But the reality at Spurs is something different, right? The framework is really tight, if you will, and and so knowing that, I think that I'm going to push back and say yes. While Tottenham probably should have not necessarily spent more money, but spent money on the right guys and made the investments at the right time. And I think that timing might have been an issue. Uh, I would go so far as to say that Spurs didn't optimize, and Pochettino included, it didn't optimize the players that they had at their disposal, right? So the one summer when after the Champions League they made no moves, the year following that they did make moves, right? Um, we spend a lot of time in sports talking about what we don't have, right? We don't have this coach, we don't have this director of football, we don't have this striker, we don't have this or that. We don't spend enough time in sports talking about what we have and what we can get, right? And so I like to focus a lot on what we have, right? What can we control, right? We can't control the next transfer market acquisition or the next young player that development. That's going to take time. What we can control is what we have. And so the year after that, Spurs did make some replacements, right? So they lost Musa Dembele to China. Musa was a huge part of Spurs at that time. They don't get to the Champions League final without Musa Dembele. He was really part of that Spurs team with Ericsson, with Dele Alli, with Harry Kane, with Son, Lucas Moura, Lloris, Jan Vertonghen, Toby Alderweireld. That was really the core. Musa Sissoko was a big part of that core as well. Danny Rose and Kieran Trippier. Those were the guys that was kind of like the core of that team. So they started to replace that core that year. They started with Tanguy Ndombele from Lyon. I think they paid about 56 million euros for him. And Ndombele really fit the profile, the archetype of a Musa Dembele, right? I know he played a lot as a number 10 under Mourinho, but really what Tanguy Ndombele is the position that he's playing right now with Napoli, right? Which is a little bit of a deeper role, but one where from that deeper position, he can leverage his skills to run forward, right? Kind of like a running back in the NFL. And that's what Musa Dembele was. And it's very interesting because Musa Dembele, when he first came up with Fulham, played in that number 10 role. He was kind of considered like this kind of forward, the scoring player. He never really was that, right? He wanted to get on the ball. He wanted to pass it. He wanted to run with it. And that's what Tanguy Ndombele was. If you look at the archetype, that's what he was. And I think Tottenham didn't do a really good job of integrating Tanguy. I don't think they did a really good job of understanding who he was when he did play. I don't think they used him that well. And of course, I think the conversation around Tanguy's fitness, him actually wanting to be there, him, meeting some of the demands of the culture around the team. There seemed to be a disconnect there, right? So, for example, Pochettino, we hear about how much he cared about fitness, right? The two days, the running, the wrestling and training, all those things, all those stories with Pochettino was really what made Spurs who they were, right? It helped them perform even above the talent that they had, right? So, while Tanguy from a talent perspective really fits Spurs and as a replacement for Musa Dembele, did he as a culture, from a culture perspective? I think that's up for debate, right? And I think his time at Spurs was compounded Some of his failures at Spurs were compounded by the fact that he then got managers that didn't really believe in him. Right, Mourinho was almost, he's kind of like that anti-football manager, right? He wants to play on the counter. Same with Nuno. Same with Conte. Tonga was never going to survive um, with those guys there, and he's played with Napoli this year. I think he's played 22 times, and um, he hasn't been a big part of the title team, but more and more you see Spalletti playing him, and his talent is undoubtable, right? But it was, for me, it was good talent evaluation. I think what there was a disconnect in terms of building the whole profile around Tanguy. And then I think the management change, right? The management change really impacted his ability to become the best version of himself, right? Because when Pochettino leaves, there's upheaval, right? Mourinho is a huge personality when you bring him out of football club, and that management change really has a tendency to kind of depreciate assets. And I hate saying that because I like a lot of I like Mourinho, I love the personality, I love all of that, but that's just a fact, right? And something similar with Conte. They also brought in Giovanni Lo Celso. Lo Celso didn't play a lot in the World Cup recently against Argentina, but he was part of their Copa success and played for PSG. He's a really talented player. I was watching him this week for Villarreal versus Sevilla, and he looked amazing. He looked great, and he was a real value add for Villarreal, and and Lo Celso essentially was the guy replacing Christian Eriksen, right? That guy that can play that number 10 role or play that more withdrawn role, but could really kind of run a game from midfield like Ericsson did. So we saw Ericsson play different positions, right? With Pochettino, he played 4-2-3-1 on the right side, which honestly didn't really make sense, but he was very narrow. He played as a natural number 10. He would play in a three, where he'd be in a more withdrawn role. And now, as he's gotten older, we're seeing him with United playing a much deeper role. And Lo Celso did a lot of that. He did a lot of that with PSG. He does that with Argentina. I just want to see, he played for another club as well, where he was excellent, right? Which is why he got the move to Spurs. I think it was Betis. Yeah, so he was on loan at Betis. Um, and the goals and stuff like that, and those numbers aren't no, the goals are actually, he scores 8 goals on loan in 2018, 2019, and he gets a move to Tottenham, essentially to replace Christian Eriksen, who goes to Inter. Again, a lot of it has been injuries, but also the management changes, right, at Spurs. And what you see now is, you kind of forget that Giovanni Lo Celso was actually at Tottenham. You actually forget that. And then I want to kind of briefly mention a couple other players that Spurs had. Steven Bergwijn. People are going to talk about, hey, Steven Bergwijn wasn't good for Spurs. I don't agree with that. I don't think he was asked to do things that he was good at. Steven Bergwijn, and I'm a big Bergwijn fan. I thought it was a great deal. I think Tottenham made a great deal to get him, and it was a pity that he's now gone and he's gone to Ajax. Another part of that kind of fall for Spurs was Dele Alli, right? Dele Alli became essentially a sunk cost. Um, I think a lot of that stuff was off the field. There's something that's happened off the field with Dele that he went from being this kind of superstar for Spurs, for England, to now, essentially being, I think he's at Everton technically, but he's essentially kind of without a club, right? You don't see Everton signing him. Um, so I have some people doing some gardening work in the background. Sorry about that, but I'm just gonna plow through this because I don't want to do this again. Um, the other and now there's a couple other moves that I want to talk about before I kind of go to the other aspects of this article. Number one is Marcus Edwards. Marcus Edwards, obviously much highly touted by at Tottenham. Pochettino compared him to Messi. He talks about him in his book as well. And he goes and he went to a small club. I think he went to Estoril Praia. Let me just see. Tottenham let him go. No, he went. No, my mistake actually. He goes on loan to Norwich. Goes on loan to Excelsior in Holland, and then he goes to Vitoria in Portugal. Signs a four-year deal. They purchased 50% of his economic rights, and they had a $15 million buyout clause. Does really well for them and gets a move to Sporting, right? And going to Sporting is a big deal, right? Sporting is arguably one of the best clubs at identifying talent, developing it. Obviously, they have a real, great heritage with respect to that. But Marcus Edwards, right? It's all this management change. Marcus Edwards leaves the club. Now he's at Sporting, and he's starting week in and week out for them. He's been a really good player for them. That's a guy that could have been at Spurs, right? And then 40 games at Sporting, he has 10 goals, and he's been phenomenal for them. They also lost Noni Madueke at that time, right? Noni Madueke, if you just look at his physical characteristics, really, really interesting player, right? Should be at Spurs. He's not. What happens? He leaves. He goes to PSV, signs a 3-year contract at PSV, and recently made the big move from PSV to Chelsea for 28 million euros, 33 million euros. That's a Spurs player. They lose him in all that management change. Two other players that they lose recently. One was Jack Clark. I love Jack Clark, and the other one is Dennis Shirkin, a left back. Dennis Shirkin last week, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, scored 2 goals in a Sunderland game for a Sunderland team that's chasing promotion from the Championship. Right? He's been really good. They're currently sixth, and they play tomorrow against Watford. When I think about Jack Clark in particular, Jack Clark's been good this year. He has 8 goals in 43 games, and but he's created a lot more than that. I would love to look at the statistics and what they say, but again, he was a victim of Tottenham. The club is not settled. Players can't be settled. He was a really great signing when he happened. Tottenham never integrated him into the first team. Never even integrated him onto the bench, and they essentially lose him for nothing. Right, a good young player who they lose for nothing, or are very limited. I think it was a very small transfer fee. Let me just look at it. It was an undisclosed fee, but I suspect they didn't recoup the 10 million that they paid for him. But that's beside the point, right? I think what they lost was a real talented player, right? If Spurs are a team that want to play football, they want to play with the ball on the ground, they want to run at people, they want to pass the ball. Jack Clark is the kind of guy that you want on your team, and they lose him for essentially nothing, right? And that's another big loss for them. And a lot of this is a product again of management change, right? When you change management, these are some of the things that happen. So I have a couple more comments, and I want to kind of wrap this up. I kind of meandered a little bit. I'm going to share a quote again from Ben in his article, and please go read it. It's a great article, and Ben's a great writer. While his successors Jose Mourinho, Nuno Espirito Santo, and Antonio Conte, uh, perhaps to the greatest extent, were backed in the market, the club is still paying for not investing sufficiently under Pochettino after he guided them to a second place finish in the Premier League in 2017 and a Champions League final in 2019. They even made history in 2018, becoming the first Premier League club to go through a full summer transfer window. And we talked about this without signing a single player. And I think the year before that, they signed Lucas Moura, which was their only deal. They had an opportunity to build on their success and stay ahead of the competition, but settled and are now paying the price for it. Um, the first comment I'm going to make is, you know, the fact that Spurs went from Pochettino, who pressed high, who wanted to play with the ball, wanted to play out of the back, who was a very progressive manager in every way. The fact that Spurs went from that to Mourinho, to Santo, to Conte, guys that don't want to play with the ball. The guys that are very defensive, guys that are, structured to a fault almost, right? And they play a style that is completely against what Tottenham is built or what Tottenham is selling to the fans over the course of the last 40, 50 years. That part of it, how does that happen, right? It shows that the club is not necessarily aligned. I remember before they hired Santo, I believe Daniel Levy said that they want to play progressive football. They want a football coach that shares their values of how they want to play, and for them to kind of be on these run of managers that don't want to play that way, it kind of shows that there's a real fault in how they're going about thinking about the role of coach, the role of manager, right? And I think it's clear that they're unaligned in this position. The second comment I would have is Ben, and this is a common theme when you're talking about football in particular is money, right? Spending money, just spend money, spend money. It's not about spending money, right? It's about spending. It's about operating within your business framework, which I think Daniel Levy has done a marvelous job of over the years. What he's done is amazing, right? He's built a football club essentially organically, without having kind of the resources of City or of what Newcastle have now, what Chelsea have or have had, and what United have, what Liverpool, even Liverpool have, right? And he's built this thing from through sheer will, vision, execution. He's done a phenomenal job, right? And so for me, it's never just about spending money, right? It's about who you spend your money on, how you got there. But I think the main problem is in this case is not that Tottenham didn't spend money, is that they stopped building their team, right? They reached a critical mass with Delhi and with Ericsson and with Harry, who came through the system with Son, who was a great signing. And they got to a critical mass, and they were like, "Hey, we just stopped building." No, you need to continue to build. You want to continue to add, even if your team wins a quadruple, you still want to continue to build, continue to add, continue to move, and the timing has to just be right. And what Spurs did was they kind of took a couple of years off, almost right, or took a window off. And I think if there was no player out there that was going to add value to your squad in the moment, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, then that's fine, right? Although that doesn't seem possible. But the fact that they didn't go out and really improve their team overall, improve the club overall, I think that's what the problem is, right? They stopped building. Um, Again, I'm going to go back to a Ben quote. This is a rudderless boat without direction. Chairman Daniel Levy needs to get the next appointment right to win over a frustrated fan base and put Spurs on the right track. It will not appease supporters fully, but it would be a step in the right direction. Let me answer this. Comment on this. It's not about the next appointment. The next appointment is irrelevant. Will the next appointment leave the institutional knowledge behind that will help Spurs be great for the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 15 years, the next 20 years? People need to learn in sport from what happened in Arsenal, right? Arsene Wenger was a great coach. He didn't leave any institutional knowledge behind. Sir Alex Ferguson, Harvard is making business reviews or business cases based off of Ferguson's success. He didn't leave any institutional knowledge behind. Even now, it's really Ten Hag and the greatness of Ten Hag that is dragging United forward. It's not really institutional knowledge that is institutional knowledge or that infrastructure or architecture, if you will, that is driving United forward. It's not a system. It's really one man driving this thing forward. And of course, there's other smart people there, but it's really Ten Hag, right? They got that right. We're seeing something similar with the Patriots with Bill Belichick, right? There's a great podcast over the summer, not over the summer, after the NFL season, between Bill Simmons and Seth Wickersham, where Seth Wickersham is talking about how the Kraft family feel like they're out of the loop with Bill Belichick, right? And you get the sense, and you see this with a lot of Bill Belichick's disciples, that they think they know what Bill's good at and why he's so great, but he doesn't seem to have transferred a lot of what makes him great over to them, right? And so it's not about just finding the one great manager, right? It's not about Nagelsmann, it's not about Enrique, it's not about Mourinho, it's not about Conte. It's bigger than that, right? And so that's why for me, it's really important to get the first thing right, right? And there's a whole series of things, right? I refer to this as being heuristics. I think heuristics is the ultimate competitive advantage in sports. Um, Appointing the manager is a little bit further down the list, or the coach. The first thing that Spurs need to decide is, are they going to have a head coach? Or are they going to have a manager? This next thing that they have to decide is that who's going to hire him? Is this a Daniel Levy hire? Is this a director of football hire? Who's hiring this person? What does that process look like? And so the name of the manager in many ways is irrelevant. It's how you get there, how you think about the subject. Um, and this kind of leads me into the next part of Ben's article. He writes, Scott Munn, who recently joined Spurs, joined as a chief football officer earlier this month. The appointment of the former City Football Group executive should allow Daniel Levy to relinquish some control, though it remains to be seen how much influence Munn will have on transfers and managerial choices. Right now, essentially, Paratici, I'm butchering his name. I'm gonna have to go back and look at it. I'm butchering his name, but that's the role he had, right? He's a managing director of football, very similar role to what's being described here. Now, I think this is a great role. Obviously, the pedigree for Scott Munn is excellent. The question is, and this is kind of the question that, um, in my opinion, in some ways, is an epidemic in sports, is specifically football. Who's making the decisions? Is Scott Munn actually going to be making these decisions? What's his title? What's his job description? Now, I know he has a title, but what's his job description? What are his roles and responsibilities? The moment that there's ambiguity on these subjects, it's hard for a team to become the best version of itself, right? And we saw this with Ed Woodward, right? For maybe 10 years after Alex Ferguson left, it was unclear who was making the decisions. Was it Ed Woodward? Was it someone else? Was it the owners? Was it the head coach? Was it Ali? Was it David Moyes? Was it Louis Van Gaal? Was it Jose? Who was making the decisions? And that ambiguity, you lost more than $1 billion in the transfer market, and you wasted 10 years. The time, imagine the amount of time that they lost doing that, right? And so the ambiguity, right? And that's important because when there's ambiguity, then you don't know who's accountable. Again, in that podcast earlier this week with Mike and Chris, you know, Chris Sutton throws Conte under the bus. Conte is kind of throwing Daniel Levy under the bus. That ambiguity that needs to go away. There needs to be absolute clarity on who's making the decisions and what they are, right? What is a guy's job description or the individual's job description, and who's making these decisions. Let me just see. Just going through my notes. And this is kind of just piggybacking off my last comment. I'm going to conclude. Having been reluctant to bring in a new manager until the end of the season makes sense. Spurs could do a lot worse than accelerate their search and crucially back him in to overhaul the squad in the summer. Yeah, so my comment on that again was it's not about who they hire, right? That's not the issue. It's how they hire them. It's how the club thinks about the overall institution of coaching. What does a Tottenham manager look like? What does the hiring process look like? How do we scout managers? There's a great article, I think, in the Guardian from about 5, 6, 7 years ago when Southampton was Southampton about Les Reed, and I think Les Reed is now at the FA. And I think the article was titled Les Reed's Drawer, right? And you'd keep a list of managers in his drawer because Southampton inevitably was going to lose managers, and they wanted to be prepared. And now I know teams of Brighton, other clubs have really taken this to heart and are doing a great job, but you'll be surprised that not every club is doing this, all right? They're not scouting managers, all right? They're not succession planning. How do we develop managers and coaches internally, right? That's something that's missing big time in football, right? There's a way to kind of, yes, first of all, you want to hire the right manager, you want to keep them forever, right? That's the ideal. That doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes you have to get rid of a manager. Sometimes a manager moves on. Who's going to be that next guy, right? And so you have to always be preparing for that because it's such a capital intensive loss. When you lose a manager for whatever reason, if you make a mistake, the next guy comes in. Mourinho comes in, Conte comes in. They have different ideas. They have different ways of building a team. Even though they kind of want to play this similar style of football, they have a different way of doing that. They have a different approach. And so, you want to be able to be able to mitigate that risk. How do you do that? You do that by creating the institution of coaching, right? You create that by creating an apparatus that's able to go out and scout managers all the time, right? Even if you have, Guardiola, you want to be scouting the next manager all the time because he's not forever. You want to be able to develop managers and coaches internally, right? When Plymouth Argyle lost Ryan Lowe, they replaced him with Steven Schumacher, who was Ryan Lowe's assistant, right? Most of the time, assistants go with the manager, right? The idea that the assistant can actually take over for the manager, and he's capable of doing that, that's foreign in football, right? You don't see that enough in football, and so and that's why Plymouth Argyle has been so successful. They've been succession planning, um, and they've been developing internally, and I'm sure they're developing the next guy. Um, and then the next thing is, how do we think about the subject as a whole, right? How do we think about coaching? Should we have a coach? Should we have a manager? How do we think about the subject? That's the competitive advantage. The competitive advantage is not just bringing Nagelsmann in. Nagelsmann eventually is going to go back to Bayern. He's going to go to Barca. He's going to go to Real. He's going to go somewhere else, right? He's going to go to PSG. Um, you know, just getting him in, that's that's a win. That's a short-term win. That's a win right now. But are you creating that long-term value within your organization, within your football club? And I would say no, right? Um, and I'll leave you with this. For those who want to understand this process better, I would say read Bill Walsh, right? I think Bill Walsh is one of the ultimates. He has a great coaching tree. He really believed in the idea of transferring knowledge. He was a general manager. He was a head coach, and he really touched all these different parts of an organization. And which is why he was so great. And he's someone I look at and read about Bill. There's books written about him. There's articles. There's a great article in the HBR about him. Um, Lastly, for my next vlog or a future vlog, I want to talk about Spurs' current roster structure, right? Because we spend a lot of time in football talking about, again, what we don't have, right? Hey, Spurs need to go out into the transfer market and bring in players. Well, they can't do that right now, right? They need to focus on what they have, right? How do we maximize what we have right now? They have guys coming back, right? Regulon, we forgot about him. He's coming back. Celso's coming back. Joe Rodon coming back. Tonga and Dumbledore. All these guys are out on loan. They're all coming back, right? Um, and so you want to see where things go forward. But I want to leave you three names that I think are really important. Son is 30. Harry Kane is 29. He's on the last year of his contract. Who's going to be next year? And Hugo Lloris is 36, right? The core of Spurs is going to have to change. There needs to be a reset at the club. And it's going to be interesting to see where the club goes from here. For my next vlog, what I want to do is, and I guess I'm not used to talking for this long continuously, basically to myself. And so, which is why I'm kind of struggling here towards the end. But for my next vlog, I want to talk about Spurs' roster structure and how the fact that Son is 30, the fact that Kane is 29 and heading into the last year of his contract, Hugo Lloris is 36, how all of this factors into what they do next. And roster structure is going to be a big part of that, right? Because not only do Spurs need to acquire players, they need to actually build their roster up correctly. What you have right now in the Spurs roster is you have a ton of roster replication, right? I keep saying this over and over. They have like 6 or 7 central defensive midfielders, right? Or versions of that, right? Højbjerg, Betancourt, Harry Winks is going to come back, Oliver Skip, Sarr, Basuma is going to come back from injury. He was a big loss for Spurs this year. People are going to disagree with me that these guys are all not just central defensive midfielders. They are versions of that, right? None of these guys are necessarily attacking players. None of these guys are essentially goal scorers. None of these guys are runners. They're not highly skillful with the ball. They're not they're not pinging balls all over the place in terms of passing. There are elements of that in Højbjerg's game, in Betancourt's game, in Harry Winks' game, if you will. But generally, these guys are defensive minded. They're gritty. Betancourt may be the exception there. Maybe the exception there. I'm gonna have to go look more at his tape. But Spurs roster right now does not make sense. It's really hard to figure out how they came up with this. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the club and to fix this, because the Spurs under Pochettino were very structured. The way that Pochettino, if you remember, when Pochettino first took over, the guys, I remember there was an FA Cup game or a League Cup game against Arsenal, and the guys that were in the midfield were Nabil Bentaleb, who's at Angers now, and Ryan Mason, who obviously unfortunately got injured and had to retire and was the Spurs caretaker manager. Um, and he went from there to get to Sissoko, Dembele, Wanyama. Victor Wanyama was really good for Spurs. Harry Winks, um, and he transitioned from that, right? But he didn't. Ben Taylor was a good player. Ryan Mason was a good player, but those guys obviously weren't the guys that were going to take Spurs to the Champions League final, et cetera, right? Um, but he made the most of them at that time. But the most important thing was that he went from kind of this weird squad, the one that he inherited, and he really cleaned it up. And they're really well structured, and a lot of that, again, you don't know if that's Pochettino, you don't know if that's Daniel Levy, you don't know who to give the credit to, right? Because the decision making structures in football clubs are so ambiguous, which is why when I'm going about building a football club or building any team, the three things that I start with is, what is your ambition? It is impossible to be successful at the highest level without ambition. And ambition, in my opinion, is not necessarily tied to spending money. Second thing is corporate governance. Um, what are some of the procedures, the best practices that you have in place to ensure that you don't have what's happening for example right now at Juventus, right? That corporate governance model is really important. And the third thing is organizational structure, right? The separation between what I like to call separation between church and state, where you have the business side and then you have the sporting side, right? And Spurs, that's always been blurred. And you see that a lot of clubs, right? You see that United. But you look at the best clubs, you look at you look at Liverpool, you look at City. It's not that way over there, right? They've figured it out. They're doing it the right way. Arsenal is doing it the right way now, and so these are some of the things that we need to think about. As I said, these are great learning opportunities. When you read an article, it could be anywhere, right? It could be in GQ, it could be in Forbes, it could be an Architectural Digest, right? I think there's a lot of value in reading something and then extrapolating things out of that are relevant for your subject, and then embedding them into your process. And the reason that it's important is you want to continuously evolve, right? My wife was reading this book about a baby book that she got from the library, and the first question I asked her was, when was the book published, right? Because you want to remain current, right? That doesn't mean that knowledge that existed 20 years ago is irrelevant today. It still very much be relevant, but obviously, it's possibly that it's slightly outdated. And so that's why the team building process is your competitive advantage. But the other aspect of that competitive advantage is always evolving that, right? And so when you read an article, you have an opportunity to learn something new, to fortify something you already know, with an example, and continue to embed those things into your process. And I think that's going to help. That's going to help you execute better as a director of football, as a general manager, as a sporting director, whomever you may be. So this has been really long. And I don't know how valuable it's been, but hopefully, I'm trying to get back, and I'm trying to kind of do this more often. And I think one that I want to do this weekend is I definitely do want to do one that discusses Spurs roster structure, and I want to do a couple other ones, maybe in the championship, maybe in another league as well. So with that, I'm going to end. Thank you, whoever ends up listening to this. Thank you very much, and please leave your comments and feedback, and I hope to come back with something more valuable next time.